The HOA was officially taking over my mountain mansion. Their reason? I refused to pay HOA fees that they literally just invented. The HOA president handed me an eviction notice and told me my home, the one I built as a tribute to my late wife, was now going to be their private hunting lodge. She gave me 14 days to get out. She thought I was just some powerless old man she could easily bully. What she didn't know was that she was threatening a sitting governor. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, because this revenge is about to be legendary. And if you believe no HOA deserves the power to destroy a family's legacy, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the moment their entire corrupt kingdom comes crashing down. The quietest part of coming home is the last mile. The paved county road gives way to packed gravel, and the sound of the tires changes to a low, satisfying crunch. My old truck knows the way by heart. I'd been gone a week, up north visiting my son Davy and his family, a trip I tried to make every few months. The city noise always wore on me, and I was looking forward to the absolute silence of my mountain. As I rounded the final bend, I could just see the edge of the roofline through the thick pine trees. I built that house with my own hands, every last beam and stone, right after I retired. It was for Sarah, my wife. She'd always wanted a place where the stars were the only streetlights. We only got a few years in it before she passed, but it was our place. It is our place. I pulled up to the main gate, a heavy timber and iron thing Davy and I had put up years ago, and my foot hit the brake, hard. There was a lockbox on the chain, not my lockbox, and next to it, staked into the ground, was a cheap, laminated sign. The words were printed in an ugly, aggressive font: property unpaid, and repossessed by Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. I sat there for a long moment, the engine idling, just staring at it. HOA? There wasn't an HOA up here, not a real one. There was a voluntary mountain committee that handled road grading and collected a couple $100 a year for snowplowing. I always paid my share. Repossessed? That was a word for a bank, not a neighborhood club. I got out of the truck, the door groaning in the quiet air. The sign was flimsy, already peeling at the corner. It felt like a joke. A very bad, very unfunny joke. As I was examining the lock, a pristine white sedan I didn't recognize pulled up behind my truck. A woman with a severe haircut and a clipboard stepped out. She wore a blazer that looked too stiff for the mountains, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was Linda Purvine, the new president of the committee, or HOA, or whatever she was calling it now. I'd seen her at one of the potlucks a year ago, talking about improving community standards. I recognized the look. It was the look of someone who measures power in the thickness of their rulebook. "Tom, isn't it?" she said, her voice crisp. "I was hoping to catch you. We need your keys." I looked from her face to the sign, then back. "Linda, what is this?" She tapped her clipboard. "This is notice, Tom. As per the bylaws of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, your property is in violation, delinquent on the new usage fees, plus several backdated fines." She was enjoying this. I could see it in the little smirk she couldn't quite hide. Usage fees? Backdated fines for what? Her smile widened. Fines for hosting non-member guests without prior approval. Your son was here last month, wasn't he? And your friends before that? The ones with the veteran license plates? My blood ran cold. She was fining me for having my own son visit me, for having my old army buddies up for a weekend of fishing. "This isn't an HOA-controlled area, Linda," I said, keeping my voice level. "It's what you learn first in a command position. Never let them see you sweat. This is a voluntary committee. It has no authority over my private land." She let out a small, condescending laugh. "Oh, it is now," she said, puffing out her chest just a little. The charter was rewritten and put to a community vote. It passed. "We have full enforcement authority, and according to our records, your payments are severely overdue." She slid a piece of paper from her clipboard and handed it to me. It was an invoice from hell. thousands of dollars in fees I'd never heard of, fines that were pure fiction, and a massive late payment penalty. At the bottom, in red letters, it said, "Payment due in full within 14 days, or property will be seized and auctioned to recover losses." Seized, auctioned, my home. The place where Sarah's ashes were scattered in the rose garden she planted by the porch. The place where every sunrise over the valley was a memory of her. The quiet rage that started in my chest was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I just folded the paper and looked at her. "I'm not paying this, and you're not taking my home." Her smug expression faltered for just a second. She wasn't used to people saying no. "You don't have a choice," she snapped, recovering quickly. "The law is on our side. You will vacate the premises." I got back in my truck, started it, and put it in gear. There was a small service road I'd cut through the woods years ago that bypassed the main gate. It was overgrown, but it would do. As I drove past her, she yelled, "This will only make it worse for you." Back inside, the house was cold and still. I dropped my bags and went straight to the phone. I called a legal aid office that specialized in property law. The young man on the other end was polite and listened patiently. I explained the situation, the sudden appearance of an HOA with teeth, the insane fees. He asked for my property address and put me on hold. When he came back, his voice was different. Softer. "Mr. Rivers, I'm sorry, but it looks like she's right. Our records show your parcel was part of a recent annexation vote. A new HOA charter for Pine Ridge was filed with the county 6 weeks ago. It was voted on by mail-in ballot. According to this, they have the authority." A mail-in vote? I never got a ballot. I never heard a word about any of it. They had done this in the shadows, quietly, and legally, turning a neighborhood committee into a dictatorship. The rest of the day was a blur. I walked the property line, checking the old stone markers my father and I had put in place when I first inherited the land. This land was mine. It wasn't a number in some HOA file. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, I saw headlights coming up the main road. Not to my gate, but to the edge of the clearing that overlooked the small lake. A work truck pulled up, and 2 men got out. They started unloading prefabricated wood panels and equipment. I watched from my porch, a heavy feeling settling in my gut. They worked fast, with purpose. Under the fading light, I saw what they were building: hunting blinds. 2 of them, positioned on my land, pointing toward the water where the deer came to drink at dawn. An hour later, my son Davy called. "Dad, did you see this?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. "A buddy of mine who likes to hunt just sent me a link." He sent it to my phone. It was a new page on the Pine Ridge HOA website. There was a big glossy picture of my house, my home, taken from the road. The headline read, "Now accepting reservations. The Pine Ridge Members Lodge and Hunting Reserve." They weren't just taking my house, they were turning it into a vacation rental. They were selling tickets to hunt on the land where I'd spread my wife's ashes. They hadn't just picked a fight. They had started a war, and they had no idea who they were starting it with. The community meeting was held in the old fire hall, a small cinder block building that smelled faintly of diesel and stale coffee. I walked in 5 minutes early, wearing a simple flannel shirt and jeans. I didn't want to look like a threat. I wanted to look like a neighbor. The room was half full, mostly with faces I didn't recognize. Newer folks, weekenders from the city, who had bought up the smaller cabins. They had the look of people who owned a piece of the mountain but weren't part of it. They checked their phones and talked in low voices about stock prices and ski conditions. Linda Purvine sat at the head of a long folding table, flanked by her board. I recognized Barry Slink, the compliance enforcer, a fleshy man with a mustache who looked like he'd gotten lost on his way to a security guard tryout. Next to him was Wes Porter, the treasurer, a nervous, bird-like man who wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. I took a seat in the back. I had my property deeds in a manila folder. along with every tax receipt going back 30 years. My plan was simple: present the facts, appeal to reason, and de-escalate. War is what you do when talking fails. I hadn't given up on talking yet. Linda called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel that was much too large for the small table. She ran through a few tedious agenda items: new rules about garbage can placement, a motion to approve the color beige for all mailboxes. Then she got to me. "Finally," she said, looking right at me with that icy smile, "we have the matter of the non-compliant property at 14 Mountain Crest Road." She didn't use my name. I was just an address. A problem to be solved. I stood up. "My name is Tom Rivers. I live at that address. I'd like to understand the basis for the fines and the seizure notice." I kept my voice steady, respectful. I laid out my case calmly. I explained that I'd been a landowner here for decades, that my family had been here for generations. I stated that the mountain committee had always been voluntary, and its powers limited to road maintenance. I held up my original deed. "This land is mine, free and clear," I said. "It was never subject to an HOA with the authority to fine or repossess." Linda listened with a look of profound boredom. When I was finished, she didn't even pause. She picked up a stack of papers from the table. "Thank you for your comments, Tom," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. However, as was previously explained, the homeowners of Pine Ridge voted to ratify a new charter. "You've been outvoted." She slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me. "And for the record, we have your signed compliance agreement right here." I walked to the table and picked it up. It was a photocopy of a generic community standards form. At the bottom, next to the signature line, was a messy scrawl that was supposed to be my name. It looked nothing like my signature. They hadn't even tried to make it look real. It was a forgery, and a bad one at that. "I never signed this," I said, my voice low. "This is a fraud." Linda just shrugged. "It's in our files. It's been notarized." She looked out at the small crowd. "Are there any other questions?" Silence. The new homeowners looked uncomfortable, but none of them spoke. They just wanted to get back to their quiet weekends. This wasn't their fight. As I walked back to my seat, feeling the weight of every silent stare, an older woman leaned over from the row in front of me. It was Nancy Albright, a retired nurse who'd lived up here even longer than I had. Her face was etched with worry. "Be careful, Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They did the same thing to George Peterson. Fined him for the rust on his old pickup truck, then for the height of his grass, then for the color of his roof shingles. Fined him right out of his house. He had to sell last spring. He'd lived here his whole life." A cold dread washed over me. George was a good man, a Vietnam vet, who lived on a small pension. This wasn't just about me. It was a pattern. They were purging the mountain of its original residents, the people who didn't fit their new, exclusive vision. I looked back at Linda and her board. They were a corporate raiding party, disguised as a neighborhood committee. They weren't just taking my home for a hunting lodge. They were taking the whole mountain, parcel by parcel, and turning it into a private reserve for their wealthy friends and donors. Anyone who objected, anyone who couldn't afford their endless stream of bogus fines, was forced out. Suddenly, it all made sense. The mail-in vote I never heard about, the new owners who stayed silent, the forged signature. This was a hostile takeover, executed with clipboards and bylaws instead of weapons. The rest of the meeting was a blur. I sat there, the forged document clutched in my hand, as they approved budgets and planned community events that nobody from the old neighborhood would be welcome at. I walked out before they officially adjourned. I didn't trust myself to stay quiet any longer. The air outside was crisp and cold, a welcome shock, after the stuffy room. Instead of driving home, I turned down the old access road that led past the community memorial garden. It was a small plot of land near the entrance to the mountain, with a few simple stone benches where you could sit and look out over the valley. One of those benches was dedicated to the veterans from our community. A simple brass plaque listed a half-dozen names. men who had served and come back to find peace in these hills. When I got there, I stopped the truck. The garden was gone. The grass was torn up, replaced by a wide patch of freshly graded dirt and gravel. In the center of the muddy mess was a new, professionally printed sign: future parking for Pine Ridge Lodge members. They had bulldozed the memorial. The stone benches were gone, shattered into pieces and pushed into a pile at the edge of the clearing like garbage. My heart hammered against my ribs. I got out and walked through the mud, my boots sinking into the soft earth. Something glinted in the dirt near the pile of broken stone. I bent down and picked it up. It was one of my old dog tags. I'd hung it on a nail under the memorial bench years ago, a small, private tribute to the men I served with. The metal was cold and covered in grime. I closed my fist around it, the edges digging into my palm. I stood there for a long time, staring at the destruction, at the empty space where a piece of our community's soul had been. The rage inside me cooled, hardening into something else, something solid and clear. This wasn't about my house anymore. This was about memory and respect, and a promise made to the people who had earned their peace on this mountain. As I walked back to my truck, I said the words to myself, a quiet vow in the cold mountain air. They picked the wrong hill to take. I didn't fight back. Not yet. The day after the meeting, I drove down to the nearest electronics store and bought 3 small motion-activated trail cameras, the kind hunters use. I spent the afternoon placing them in discreet spots around my property, concealed in the knot of an old oak, tucked under the eave of the woodshed, and disguised in a birdhouse overlooking the main gate. Then, I became a ghost. I stopped answering the door. I let calls from unknown numbers go to voicemail. To Linda and her crew, I was just a sad old man, defeated and waiting for the eviction clock to run out. I made a point of looking defeated. When I drove into town for groceries, I kept my eyes down. I let my shoulders slump. I let the grief for my wife, a private and steady ache, show on my face. Let them think I was broken. Let them underestimate me. It's the oldest and most effective tactic in the book. My first move was to find the people they'd already broken. I started with George Peterson. It took a few calls to track him down at the small apartment he was renting in town. When I met him for coffee, he looked smaller than I remembered, diminished. He told me the whole story, how the fines started as a trickle and became a flood. He showed me a shoebox full of violation notices. One was for improperly stored firewood, another for a small oil stain on his gravel driveway. Each fine came with a late fee, and the late fees had interest, and soon he was drowning in a debt he could never repay. I just couldn't fight them, Tom, he said, staring into his cup. I'm 73 years old. My fightin' days are over. I just listened. Then I asked him for a copy of every piece of paper the HOA ever sent him. He gave me the whole box. Next, I went to see Nancy Albright. She was a fortress of information. She had kept a meticulous diary of every strange new rule, every odd meeting, and every family that had been pushed out. She had dates, names, and details. She told me about the mail-in ballot. It came in a plain white envelope, she said. Looked like junk mail. I almost threw it out. A lot of people probably did. She'd voted no, of course, but her one vote was a whisper in a hurricane. The picture was getting clearer. This wasn't just a power grab. It was a calculated fraud. A few days later, I drove to the county records office. It's amazing what you can find if you're patient and know where to look. I spent hours pulling property tax records for every parcel in the Pine Ridge area. And then I found it. The key. Over a dozen undeveloped lots, mostly wooded and deemed unsuitable for building, were all owned by a handful of LLCs, limited liability companies, anonymous, faceless entities. But when I cross-referenced the registration paperwork for those LLCs, the same names kept appearing as managing partners. Linda Purvine, Barry Slink, Wes Porter. They had bought up cheap, worthless land, assigned it voting rights in the community, and then used those ghost votes to push through their new charter. They had literally stuffed the ballot box with empty acres of trees. They hadn't outvoted the community, they'd outvoted it with shell companies. While I was digging, they kept pushing. One morning, Barry Slink showed up at my door, flashing a laminated ID card that read, HOA Compliance Officer. He was there to inspect my well. He claimed there was an anonymous complaint about water quality. He handed me a notice warning of potential health code violations and hefty fines. I knew my well was fine. Davy and I had drilled it ourselves to state code. This was harassment, plain and simple. I politely told him he wasn't welcome on my property without a warrant. He puffed up his chest and threatened to call the sheriff for obstructing an official inspection. I just closed the door and locked it. The next day, my power went out. Not the whole mountain, just my house. I called the utility company, and they said a work order had been placed for a mandatory safety inspection of my meter. The order, they said, came from the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. It took them 8 hours to send a crew out to turn it back on. Linda was trying to freeze me out, to make my life so difficult I would just give up and leave. But every little move they made, I documented. The trail cameras caught Barry Slink snooping around my property line. I saved the voicemails. I photographed every notice they tacked to my gate. I was building a case, brick by brick. A few nights later, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled quietly up my service road. A man in a simple, well-tailored suit got out. He didn't look like he was from the mountain. He looked like he belonged in a state capitol. I met him on the porch. We didn't shake hands. He just handed me a thick briefing folder. "Everything you asked for, sir," he said. I took it. "Any problems?" I asked. "None that couldn't be handled," he replied. We spoke for no more than 5 minutes, and then he was gone, the SUV disappearing back into the darkness. Davy drove up the next morning, his truck loaded with groceries and anger. He'd heard about the power outage. "Dad, this has gone too far. Let me handle this. Me and a couple of my guys can come up here and take down those hunting blinds. We can have a little chat with this Barry fella." He was ready to fight. His hands were clenched into fists. I looked at my son, saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had always been there. "Just let it go, Dad," he said, his voice softening. "It's a house. It's just wood and stone. It's not worth this war." I put my hand on his shoulder. I could feel the tension in him, the desperate need to protect his family's legacy, to protect me. I appreciated it more than he could ever know, but his way wasn't my way. "Not this time. I've seen real war, son," I told him, my voice quiet but firm. "This isn't war. This is just cleanup." He didn't understand. Not yet. He thought I was being passive. He thought I was letting them walk all over me. But I wasn't being passive. I was being patient. I was gathering my forces, mapping the terrain, and waiting for the perfect moment to choose my ground. Because in my world, you only start a fight you know you can win. The 14-day clock on the eviction notice was ticking down, and Linda Purvine was getting bolder. The first weekend hunt arrived, like an occupying force. A convoy of luxury pickup trucks and SUVs, all gleaming and spotless, rumbled up the mountain. They parked in the new gravel lot where the memorial garden used to be. Men in expensive camouflage gear, carrying rifles that cost more than my first car, treated my land like their personal playground. My trail cameras captured it all. Them drinking beer in the hunting blinds, laughing loudly as they trespassed within 50 feet of my home, their voices echoing through the once quiet woods. I stayed inside, watching from a window, my face a blank mask. I was just the ghost in the machine, the old man they were waiting to discard. I listened to their conversations on the camera's audio feeds. They weren't locals. They were businessmen from the city, donors Linda had lured with the promise of an exclusive mountain retreat. They talked about deals, about investments, about the new elite tier HOA that was coming soon. One of them bragged about the deal Linda had cut him. A lifetime membership for a $10,000 donation. Linda was monetizing my home, my land, my peace and quiet. She wasn't just stealing it. She was selling it off, piece by piece. Tensions peaked a few days later. I was coming back from a supply run in town when I saw Barry Slink's car parked near my service road entrance. He was blocking my way in. He got out of his car as I pulled up, swaggering toward me with a clipboard in his hand. He had the air of a man who'd finally gotten the promotion he always felt he deserved. "Rivers?" he said, not even bothering with a hello. "Got another violation for you. Unauthorized vehicle modifications." I looked at my 20-year-old truck. It was stock, plain, and covered in a respectable layer of dust. "What are you talking about, Barry?" I asked, my voice flat. "That oversized antenna," he said, pointing a chubby finger at the standard CB radio antenna I'd had on every truck I'd ever owned. "It's over the height limit specified in Appendix C, Section 4 of the new bylaws. That's another $200 fine." He tried to hand me the paper, but I just looked at him. "You're on my property, Barry. You're trespassing, and you're blocking my road. Move your car." For a second, I thought he was going to stand his ground. He puffed out his chest and took a step closer. The second-hand authority Linda gave him was like a drug. "You don't get it, old man," he sneered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Your time here is over. Linda has big plans with real money behind them. You are just a bump in the road. And I'm the guy who gets to smooth that bump out. So why don't you just pack your bags and save us all the trouble?" His little speech was so cartoonishly villainous it was almost funny. Almost. "Move your car, Barry," I said again, my voice unchanged. "Or I'll move it for you." There must have been something in my eyes, a flicker of the man I used to be, because he flinched. He took a half-step back, his bravado deflating like a cheap balloon. He mumbled something about me getting what was coming to me, then scurried back to his car and drove away. That was the last straw for Linda. She must have felt her power being challenged. The next afternoon I came home to find a new notice on my gate. This one wasn't a warning. It stated that due to ongoing health and safety concerns, and my refusal to cooperate with inspections, the HOA was exercising its right to enter the property for a routine cleanup and hazard abatement. The date was for the next morning. They weren't even pretending anymore. They were coming inside. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat in the dark, in the quiet house I built for Sarah, and I felt a profound sense of failure. I had faced down enemies on 3 continents. I had negotiated treaties and commanded battalions. But I couldn't stop a petty tyrant with a clipboard from taking away the one thing that truly mattered. The next morning, they came as promised. A cheap van from a local cleaning service pulled up, with Barry Slink directing them from the driveway like he was Patton directing the Third Army. I didn't try to stop them. I just stood on the porch and watched. 2 workers went inside, armed with trash bags and cleaning supplies. They were in there for less than an hour. They didn't take much, just a few boxes of old junk from the entryway. When they were gone, and the silence returned, I walked back inside. The house felt violated, tainted. I went from room to room, checking my things. Nothing seemed to be missing. Then, I went to the mantelpiece over the fireplace. For years, a small, hand-carved cherry wood box had sat there. It was beautiful, simple, and the last thing I had made with my wife before she got sick. Inside were her ashes. The box was gone. A cold, hollow emptiness opened up inside my chest. It was so vast and so sudden, it took my breath away. They had taken her. They had taken the last physical piece of her I had left in this world. It wasn't a hazard. It wasn't cleanup. It was cruelty. It was a calculated, deliberate act of psychological warfare, designed to break me completely. I stumbled outside to the garden, to the rose bushes she had planted, and I sank to my knees. The carefully constructed walls of calm, of patience, of strategy, all came crumbling down. The old soldier, the disciplined commander, the quiet neighbor, they all disappeared. I was just a man who had lost his wife all over again. I don't know how long I knelt there in the dirt. But as the sun began to dip below the mountains, the grief subsided, replaced by a clarity so sharp and cold it burned. This was no longer cleanup. This was retribution. I walked back into the house, my steps steady and certain. I went to my office, to the heavy oak desk I rarely used. I opened the bottom drawer, a drawer I hadn't opened since moving in. Underneath a stack of old maps, there was a large, sealed, manila envelope. I pulled it out and laid it on the desk. Inside was a single, freshly signed document, bearing the official seal of the state. It was an executive order. They thought they were picking on Tom Rivers, a retired old colonel, who wouldn't fight back. They had run my plates, checked my property records. They never checked my voter registration. They never checked who I had become after I'd retired from the army. They never once thought to check my name against the list of newly elected officials. I was the governor. And that eviction notice wasn't just an attack on my home. It was an attack on the highest office in the state. Most people didn't know I was the governor. My campaign had been quiet, focused on property rights, small businesses, and affordable housing for veterans. I wasn't one for flashy rallies or television spots. I didn't put my face on every billboard. I won because I spoke plainly to the people who had been forgotten, the people who just wanted to be left alone to build their lives. And I never, ever used my mountain home as a prop. It was my sanctuary, my private world, and I had gone to great lengths to keep it separate from my public life. My property was listed under a simple trust, one of the few luxuries I allowed myself. Linda Purvine and her board, in their arrogance, saw a name in a file and a quiet old man in a cabin. They saw a victim. They never once considered they were looking at the chief executive of the state. For months, I had watched them from my porch and from the governor's mansion in the city. I had watched them abuse their neighbors, steal land with fake paperwork, and turn our community into their personal piggy bank. I had watched, and I had let them think they were winning. I let them build their case against themselves. The box of ashes they stole, that was the final piece of evidence. It was proof of a moral bankruptcy so complete, it demanded an absolute response. With the executive order on my desk, I made the call I'd been preparing for weeks. I contacted the state attorney general's office, a no-nonsense prosecutor who had a particular distaste for fraud. The man in the black SUV had been his chief investigator. I laid it all out for him: the forged signatures, the shell companies, the illegal land annexations, the bulldozing of a veterans memorial, and the theft of personal property. I didn't just have complaints. I had a dossier thick with facts, photographs, and sworn affidavits from people like George and Nancy. The evidence was overwhelming. The Attorney General listened in silence, then asked one question. "What's the play, Governor?" I told him. It wasn't enough to just sue them. Civil court was too slow, and they could always hide their money. We had to shut them down completely, from the top down. We had to use the power of the state to correct a profound injustice. The first move was financial. Within hours, the Attorney General filed an emergency injunction, freezing all bank accounts associated with the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association and its board members. The fines they had collected, the donations from their wealthy hunting buddies, the operating budget for their lodge, it all stopped cold. The second move was administrative. My office officially revoked the charter of the HOA on grounds of systemic fraud and gross misuse of power. They were no longer a legal entity. They were just a group of people who had been breaking the law. The panic on the mountain was almost immediate. I watched it unfold from my window and through the information my aide relayed to me. Wes Porter, the treasurer, was the first to crack. When his personal credit cards were declined and the HOA account showed a zero balance, he started making frantic phone calls. Linda was next. The weekend was approaching, and a group of VIP hunters from the city were scheduled to arrive. Her lodge reservation system was offline. The catering company she had hired called to cancel because their deposit check had bounced. I saw her white sedan speeding up and down the mountain roads, stopping at Barry Slink's house, then Wes's. She was trying to rally her troops to put out the fires, but the water had been cut off. She called another emergency community meeting for the following evening. The flyers were posted on every gate, the font even larger and more aggressive than before. The notice promised a full transparency update and critical decisions for the future of our community. She was going to try and spin this. She was going to blame a clerical error, or the bank, or even me. She was going to try and use her fear and her lies to hold on to her crumbling kingdom. I didn't hide this time. When the invite was slipped under my gate, I picked it up and called the number at the bottom. Linda answered on the first ring, her voice tight and strained, a thin veneer of professional calm over a foundation of pure panic. Pine Ridge Association, Linda Purvine speaking. I kept my voice calm, the voice of the polite neighbor. Linda, this is Tom Rivers. I got your notice about the meeting. There was a pause, and I could hear the gears turning in her head. She decided to play the magnanimous leader. Ah, Tom. Yes. Given the current administrative delays, we are reviewing all outstanding enforcement actions. It would be beneficial for you to attend. She was hoping to publicly bully me into submission, to use me as an example to scare the others back into line. I appreciate that, Linda, I said. I'll be there. As a courtesy. I hung up before she could say anything else. The next evening, I didn't drive my old truck. A sleek, black state trooper convoy arrived at my gate. My aide, a sharp young woman named Sarah, a name I appreciated more than she knew, was waiting in the lead car. She handed me the official copies of the executive order and the Attorney General's indictment notices. I put on a suit for the first time in months. It wasn't a tuxedo. It was a dark, tailored suit that I wore for official state business. I pinned a small American flag to the lapel. I wasn't going as Tom the neighbor. I was going as the governor. As we drove down the mountain toward the fire hall, I felt a cold, focused calm settle over me. The waiting was over. The documentation was done. It was time for the unveiling. They had wanted a war on their own terms. They were about to get one on mine. The fire hall was packed. Every chair was taken, and people were standing along the back walls. This time, it wasn't just the new weekenders. The old-timers were here too. George Peterson was in the front row, his face grim. Nancy Albright sat beside him, a look of quiet anticipation on her face. News of the frozen bank accounts had spread like wildfire. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. At the front of the room, Linda Purvine was attempting to project an image of calm authority, but the strain was showing. Her smile was brittle, her movements jerky. Barry Slink and Wes Porter sat beside her, looking pale and nervous. A small camera on a tripod was set up in the corner, a red light blinking. Linda, in a last-ditch effort to control the narrative, was live streaming the meeting for transparency. She opened with a long, rambling speech about unforeseen administrative challenges and malicious external actors trying to undermine their community. She painted the HOA as a victim of a bureaucratic mistake, a simple misunderstanding with the bank that would soon be resolved. She never once mentioned my name, but every eye in the room kept flicking toward the empty chair they'd left for me. She was mid-sentence, blaming outdated county systems for the financial freeze, when the main doors of the fire hall swung open. I walked in. I wasn't alone. My aide Sarah walked beside me, carrying a thick binder, and 2 uniformed state troopers followed a few steps behind. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the scuff of our shoes on the linoleum floor. Every head turned. Linda's mouth hung open for a second before she snapped it shut. The color drained from her face. She looked at the troopers, then at me in my suit, and for the first time, a flicker of genuine fear appeared in her eyes. I didn't go to my empty chair. I walked straight to the front of the room and stood at the end of the table, directly opposite her. The troopers positioned themselves flanking the main door, their expressions neutral, professional. They weren't here to threaten, they were here to observe. Sarah placed the heavy binder on the table, with a solid thud that echoed in the silence. "Linda," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the quiet room. "You've made some serious accusations tonight, and you've caused a great deal of harm to this community. It's time for the real transparency you promised." I opened the binder. The first section was labeled fraudulent voting. I slid a stack of documents across the table for her to see. The county records of her LLCs, the property deeds for the empty lots, and a highlighted list showing how the votes from those uninhabited parcels had been used to pass her charter. "You didn't win a vote," I said. "You manufactured one." Next, I pulled out a file labeled forgery. It contained a certified handwriting analysis comparing the signature on my compliance agreement to my actual signature on file with the state. The expert conclusion was blunt: a crude and obvious forgery. Wes Porter, the treasurer, made a small whimpering sound and sank lower in his chair. Then came the financial records, subpoenaed by the Attorney General's office. Bank statements showing huge cash withdrawals. Invoices for personal luxuries, billed as lodge improvements, and a detailed breakdown of the illegal fine and fee scheme used to push people like George Peterson out of their homes. As I laid out each piece of evidence, a low murmur began to spread through the room. People were whispering to each other, looks of dawning comprehension on their faces. The new homeowners, the ones who had stayed silent before, now looked horrified. They were realizing they had been unwitting accomplices to a massive scam. Barry Slink, ever the enforcer, decided to try one last bluff. He stood up, puffing out his chest. "You can't just come in here and make these wild accusations. This is a private meeting. We have rules." I didn't even look at him. I simply picked up a thin folder Sarah had been holding and handed it to him. "Mr. Slink," I said quietly, "this is a state indictment for racketeering and extortion. I believe you're familiar with the rules regarding those." He stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. He opened it, read the first line, and his face went from red to a sickly gray. He sat down so heavily his chair creaked in protest. Finally, I looked directly at Linda. She was sputtering, trying to form words, but nothing was coming out. Her facade of control had completely shattered. This is illegal. You have no authority here," she finally managed to say, her voice cracking. That was my cue. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folded executive order. I unfolded it slowly, deliberately. The official state seal was visible to everyone in the room. I held it up. "Actually, Linda," I said, "I have all the authority I need." I began to read the order out loud, my voice steady and measured, each word dropping into the silence like a stone. I detailed the findings of the state's investigation. I listed the specific laws that had been broken, and then I read the final operative clause. "Therefore, by the power vested in me as governor of this state, I hereby order the following. Effective immediately, the charter of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association is permanently dissolved. All fines, liens, and fees issued by this body are declared null and void. All seized property is to be returned to its rightful owners, and the so-called members' lodge is no more." A collective gasp went through the room. For a moment, there was just stunned silence. Then, a single person started to clap. It was Nancy Albright. Then George Peterson joined in. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. It was a wave of relief and vindication washing over the hall. Neighbors were hugging each other, some with tears in their eyes. The weekenders were on their feet, clapping just as hard as the old-timers. They hadn't been villains. They'd just been lied to. Linda just stared at me, her face a mask of disbelief and pure, undiluted hatred. The troopers moved forward then, their movements calm and efficient. They approached the table. One stood behind Linda, the other behind a now trembling Wes Porter. "Ma'am, sir," the first trooper said, his voice polite but firm, "you'll need to come with us." As they were escorted out, the cameras still rolling, the public humiliation was absolute. She was a queen being, frog-marched out of her own throne room. On her way past me, her eyes locked on mine. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice filled with venomous confusion. I just looked at her. I didn't need to answer. As the troopers led them out the door, I saw an old veteran I recognized from the memorial dedications years ago. He stood up straight, caught my eye, and gave me a slow, respectful salute. I gave him a small nod back. It was done. The aftermath was quiet. Within a week, the mountain began to heal. A crew from the County Public Works Department came up and removed every last sign bearing the name Pine Ridge Homeowners Association. They were methodical, efficient, erasing Linda Purvine's short-lived reign from the landscape. The ugly laminated signs at my gate, the ridiculous parking notices, the officious rule boards, they all disappeared into the back of a dump truck. Davy came up that weekend. He didn't say much, just showed up with 2 friends from his construction crew, a flatbed trailer, and a case of cold beer. They spent the entire day dismantling the hunting blinds. They worked with a focused intensity, taking the structures apart piece by piece, as if disarming a bomb. By sunset, there was no trace the blinds had ever existed, just stacks of lumber on the trailer, ready to be hauled away. We sat on my porch, drinking beers as the last light faded from the sky, and watched the stars come out. "You could have just told me you were the governor, Dad," he said, not with accusation, but with a kind of weary amusement. I took a slow sip of my beer. "It wasn't the governor's job to do," I replied. "It was Tom Rivers' job. I just used the governor's tools." He nodded, understanding. The legal fallout for Linda and her board was swift and severe. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Wes Porter confessed to everything in exchange for a lighter sentence. His testimony sealed Linda's and Barry's fates. The state prosecuted them for fraud, extortion, and embezzlement. The story of the Hunting Lodge HOA became a minor sensation in the local news, a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. But up on the mountain, we didn't pay much attention to the headlines. We were too busy rebuilding. The first letter arrived a couple of weeks later. It was from George Peterson. His handwriting was a little shaky, but the words were strong. He and his wife were moving back into their old home. With the fraudulent liens removed, the forced sale of his house was declared invalid. The new owners, a decent young couple from the city who had bought it in good faith, were horrified when they learned the true story. They agreed to nullify the sale, and the state's Victim Restitution Fund helped cover their costs. "You gave us our home back, Tom," George wrote. "But you gave us more than that. You gave us back our peace." More letters followed. Families who had been pushed out by the fines started returning. There were new faces, too, the weekenders who had bought in under Linda's regime. They came by my house, one by one, sometimes with a freshly baked pie or a bottle of wine. They apologized for their silence, for not seeing what was happening right in front of them. They wanted to be neighbors now, not just property owners. We started a new mountain committee, the way it used to be. Simple, voluntary, and focused on things that mattered. Grading the road after a heavy rain, organizing a fire safety cleanup day, and planning a proper 4th of July barbecue. Our first official act was to rebuild the Veterans Memorial. Davy and his crew came back and built 3 new stone benches, solid and permanent. And we rededicated the garden with a simple, quiet ceremony. A few days later, a plain cardboard box was delivered to my porch by the state police. It was from the evidence locker. Inside, wrapped carefully in soft cloth, was the cherry wood box containing my wife's ashes. I took it out and placed it back on the mantelpiece, right where it belonged. It was just a box, just wood and dust. But having it back in its rightful place made the house feel whole again. The whole affair spurred a larger change. Using the Pine Ridge case as a clear example of systemic abuse, my office worked with the state legislature to pass a comprehensive HOA reform bill. The new law capped fine amounts, eliminated the power of HOAs to foreclose on homes for unpaid fines alone, and established clear, transparent voting procedures. It wasn't flashy, but it would prevent thousands of other families from ever having to face what we did. In place of Linda's hunting lodge, I used my own funds, combined with a state grant for rural development, to build a small, rustic cabin on a quiet corner of my land. We named it the Sarah Rivers Retreat, a place where veterans and their families could come to stay for free, to fish in the lake, and watch the stars without a single worry. That fall, as the leaves began to turn, I was sitting on my porch, my old dog asleep at my feet. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was thick and clean. Down by the lake, I could see the kids of a young family staying at the retreat, their laughter carrying on the breeze. It was the sound of life, of peace returning to the mountain. My life was complicated now, split between this quiet sanctuary and the noise of the capital. But in that moment, none of that mattered. This land was never theirs to take. They saw my home and saw an opportunity, a resource to be exploited. They looked at me and saw a simple homeowner, an obstacle to be removed. They forgot the most important thing. I don't just own a house here. I work for the people who live here. This wasn't just about reclaiming my property. It was about restoring a promise that a home is more than an asset and a community is more than a set of rules. It's a place where you belong. And on that mountain, we all belonged once more.